Welcome to our series on the future of capitalism from Force for Good. I'm delighted today that we're going to be speaking to Paul Polman. Paul, as many of you will know, is a famous business leader and somebody who has worked on the UN Sustainable Development Goals and has become a campaigner, someone who believes that we can change the way capitalism works to address some of the most important issues in the world. And so we're delighted to be hearing his thoughts on what it takes to make that happen. Paul has dedicated his time since he left Unilever to working to accelerate action by business to tackle climate change and inequality. He's become a leading proponent for businesses that seek to be a force for good. As CEO of Unilever for a decade, he demonstrated that a long-term multi-stakeholder model, one that cares about all the people who are affected by that business, goes hand in hand with excellent financial performance. Paul was also, as I said earlier, a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel, which developed the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and which he continues to champion, working with global organizations across the world and across industries to advance the agenda to achieve those goals by 2030. He's written a book recently too called Net Positive, which asks courageous businesses to step forward and make a huge difference to make sure that they are not the ones harming the environment. He chairs a company called Imagine, a social venture dedicated to this kind of systemic change, also the Said Business School, and is vice chair of the UN Global Compact, as well as a B team leader. He's honorary chair of the International Chamber of Commerce, which he's held for 2 years. I'm delighted to welcome Paul today. Welcome, Paul.
Good seeing you as well, Ketan. Thanks for having me on the program.
Great to see you. Thank you. Can we roll back and you tell us what is it that you're doing today and why is it so important to you?
Well, what I'm currently entirely focused on is really to accelerate the implementation of these famous Sustainable Development Goals that were approved in the UN in 2015 by about 193 countries, with the sole objective of creating a more inclusive, more sustainable society now and obviously for future generations as well. It's very clear that our system of capitalism has lifted many people out of poverty, but increasingly it's also starting to show its enormous shortcomings. Very difficult for individual CEOs to address, very difficult to expect governments to fill that gap at a time when multilateral institutions aren't quite functioning the way they are designed, when geopolitics has its challenges, as we well know. So it's the role of business to step up and fill that void. And that's what I'm focused on. And it's really driving the broader systems changes in the individual sectors of business. Think about fashion, food, tourist and travel, finance, the urban built environment. They're all very important to achieving our joint prosperity. Think about the young people and creating different levels of leaders that we do with, and think about the broader change in awareness that we need to create amongst all of us to move our own individual actions and leadership to a higher level. For the last part, we've created a book called Net Positive, How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take. And it's really meant to create this type of a movement.
Thank you, Paul. What are the biggest issues you feel that the world is facing and not managing quite to tackle?
There are many challenges, and sometimes it's overwhelming. People talk about the poly crisis. It's all coming from us from all directions. Well, some people call about the perma crisis. It's here to stay for a long time to come. And I think both of these are true, especially with COVID. We've started to discover that although our economic system has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, we've done that really in a very unsustainable way. Our linear production model of digging in the earth, getting the stuff out, stuffing it into a factory, making something and then ditching it in the landfills or in the oceans is not any more sustainable. You can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. So ultimately, our biggest challenge is our growth model. How can we do that in harmony with planet Earth, in harmony with future generations, and actually in harmony with other fellow citizens? Since COVID, we've seen that we've pushed more people back into poverty. Climate change is we're not bending the curve. We're still projecting to well above 3 degrees. And this inequality and climate change are probably the most burning issues that we need to address. But it also requires us to think about the way our economic system works. And that's probably the biggest systems change we need to make. Right now, we're trying to optimize all together in good spirit within a system, frankly, that's not designed to deliver anymore.
So Paul, let's dig into that too. The first time I heard you speak about this, I think, was at the Harvard Club in New York, and you addressed a group assembled by the New York Global Leaders Dialogue, and it was fascinating. What is the model of capitalism that you implemented at Unilever when you were there for a decade leading the organization? Would you describe that?
Yeah, well, I think, firmly believe that capitalism, or if you go back to the roots of business, that its origin is really into addressing societal problems. When Lord Lever started his company in Victorian Britain, it was to address the issues of hygiene. He invented the bar soap, Lifebuoy Sunlight bar soap, because 1 out of 2 babies wasn't making it past year 1. And there were enormous issues of hygiene. He didn't invent the company because he wanted to enrich himself, or he wanted to be sure that the shareholders got all the rent extraction, if you call it. No, he actually got permission to exist and permission to be successful by addressing these issues. He obviously had to do that in a profitable way because he had to, be able to invest in his business and be successful in that respect, support the future of his enterprise. But in essence, he already ran a model which he called shared prosperity, and very much the multi-stakeholder model that we talk about today. He very much believed that in order to be successful longer term, the communities in which he worked, the partners in the value chain, the citizens that you serve with your products, increasingly the planet itself, have to be a part of your considerations when you run these businesses. So what we would call the original form of capitalism that started to emerge actually during Milton Friedman's time, more or less 50, 60 years ago now, which in my opinion was misinterpreted even by our contemporaries now. I still believe that if Milton Friedman would write today again his famous paper, he wouldn't write it the same way, or we would not interpret it the same way. But anyway, it became shareholder primacy. And unfortunately, whilst it has served some people, it clearly hasn't served society at large. So the form of capitalism that we need is not in fact questioning capitalism in itself, but broadening the definition of capitalism and moving it from a myopic focus on ensuring the return for shareholders, often expressed in short-term returns, into a more sustainable long-term multi-stakeholder model. And interestingly and actually encouragingly, increasingly we see that these longer-term multi-stakeholder models that put strong purpose-driven, that put sustainability at the core, are at least, if not more profitable in general than the models that myopically focus on the shareholders. And that's not surprising to me, because I think we're at a point right now that we're seeing these enormous costs that we have to incur because of the shortcomings of our economic system, the enormous environmental cost, the enormous social cost, the enormous human costs that somehow ultimately we all have to pay for. So businesses that start to think about this more holistically, I think, are better placed for a future that we all desire to live in.
So, Paul, can we drill that down a little bit more, just so we have a very simple example that illustrates how that really works?
This world is frankly designed for about 3 billion people. We now have 8 billion people. Yeah. So when we were 3, 4, 5 billion people, we could use the rivers of this world to put our wastewater in without treating it and saving the investments of wastewater treatment. We could put our carbon into the air and not worry about it because the oceans would absorb it, or we would have enough trees to do the job for us. Unfortunately, we're now at a point that we've cut down half the trees in the world. Our waters, our land are significantly degraded or polluted. We just don't have anymore the luxury of getting these negative externalities into the world. And frankly, planet Earth cannot compensate anymore for our shortcomings. So it's sending the bills home. It's sending the bills home in terms of changing weather patterns, absence of resources that we need, access to clean air or clean water. And when you're deprived of that, many people are suffering. So we're getting to a system now where, because of the pressures that we put on, let's say, our natural capital, to start there, we're actually incurring higher costs than if we would avoid the damage in the first place. Business depends for about $34 trillion on natural capital, according to the latest estimates by the World Economic Forum. And that's a pollination of bees and giving you the crops. That is the water, that is the air, the clean air, that is the services of the land that you need, the fertility of the land. And when that is eroded or disappears, it's very difficult for most businesses that depend on nature to really exist. So it's in our interest to invest. Now, you might say, the challenge we have is that the famous prisoner's dilemma: if I invest in these things to avoid these negative externalities and my competitor doesn't, am I at a competitive disadvantage? And do I risk the continuity of my business? And that's a fair question to ask. So the first thing we rely on is governments and rules and regulations and frameworks to get a level playing field. Where there are these tragedies of the commons, these negative externalities, we often expect governments to step in. Even the die-hard capitalists who see a minimal role of government will shout quickly when there are incredible negative externalities that the government should take care of that. So there's a little bit of an hypocrisy there. But now we see increasingly also that governments are not able to deal with these increasingly global challenges, at least not at the speed that is required. And interestingly now, that businesses that start to proactively address this, either individually or in cases when that is not possible collectively, that these businesses are better placed to keep their own business models resilient, better placed in society in terms of acceptance, better placed by perhaps finding the solutions to address some of these challenges and be more innovative, better placed to attract the talent right now because people want to be part of these solutions. And that gets translated increasingly into better results. So there is a interest now, perhaps a self-interest of actively assuming responsibility for the negative externalities that our business models create.
So Paul, I hear you saying lots of things about how capitalism can impact the environment. And the responsibility to think differently about the cost structure itself, perhaps, or the investment model itself. So we take into account the impact on externalities. If I am in a market and the government hasn't set the regulations tightly enough, is there something superior in the model that you're advocating above somebody who doesn't break the law, is not polluting in that sense, because they do follow the law of the land, but they don't have a higher purpose or mission that you've outlined? And in a very, very practical sense, it's a brand manager who has a responsibility to build the brand and to sell as much soap as possible, let's say, or as much software as possible, or as many cars as possible. Is there a different mission that you give those people which results in a different and superior outcome for shareholders too? Broader stakeholders, of course, but for shareholders too.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the initial premise that these companies that stay within the law don't pollute, etc., is unfortunately not the case. In a sense, using up the scarce resources and depriving future generations from that is a form of pollution. Fishing the seas empty or cutting down forest and species disappearing. We've lost 70% in the last 5 decades of the world's species, is a form of pollution. And many governments really don't have the right frameworks or enforcement principle in place to prevent that. So it is fairly easy to extract quite a lot of rent from this wealth at its personal benefit, but at an enormous cost to others. It's if you look at the enormous costs we pay for healthcare, part of that comes from allowing tobacco to be around, or allowing air pollution to happen, or having enormous work stress because we don't have decent protections or minimum wages for people that work very hard. So we are increasingly understanding that we pay costs for failures that sometimes are higher than the benefits we can derive on the other side of the equation. And that's not so good. So smart companies are starting to understand that. So smart companies that go beyond the law and try to take responsibility for their total impact in the world, that set targets of improvement around environmental and social aspects of their business that are in line with what science tells us to do. We find increasingly that these companies are better able to attract the talent. They have more engaged employees. They're probably more aware and more in touch with what society needs, so it reflects their innovation programs. They build more resilience into their business models, and all of that ultimately has a higher probability, and I'm putting it carefully, has a higher probability to translate into better business results. So increasingly we now see and can say with a certain level of confidence that it actually pays to proactively try to mitigate these negative externalities, and that the financial market is becoming smart enough to start to value that. That wasn't the case in the past, and probably not even 5 or 10 years ago. But because of technology that has accelerated and has made many more things available, often a lag between the awareness of these technologies and what is actually available is there by many CEOs. Secondly, the enormous costs that we are now incurring of our failures that were previously probably not as visible or not as measurable as it is right now. And thirdly, the signals from the marketplace. They're very clear now that all over the world, by the way, that the citizens of this world prefer to buy from companies that have a more responsible business model in the many different aspects of ESG, if I may call it. And all of that translates into positioning your companies better for the future than the ones that would continue to negate this, might stay within the law, might try to do the minimum to get away with it, but increasingly they're actually falling behind. You know, we did a very simple study recently where we looked at all the climate leaders that are companies that proactively sign up to the science-based targets, the Paris Agreement to stay at around the 1.5 degrees Celsius, and proactively take action. And within that group, we looked at the front runners, the pace setters, the real leaders. So this is already a group of action, and we look at the real leaders. And even there, we find that the real leaders that accelerate their actions, that put word to mouth and actions to deeds, and 2030 targets, not only 2050 promises, that they have a significantly higher chance of better shareholder return than even the next group that we compared it with. So more and more studies are now pointing in that direction. And let's even put it differently by setting the bar very low. There are no real studies at scale that point in the other direction. So even if it would be equal to advocating not to do anything, I'd still prefer these companies that are trying to make this a better world than the ones that sit on the sideline when you know you have a problem.
So essentially, you're saying being conscious, aware, and responsible for the consequences of your actions is profoundly important to shareholder value. And so this free rider model where you simply take whatever you can and make the most short-term profit is long-term not good for shareholder value. Is that right?
That is absolutely right. We've seen in the US, for example, the number of publicly traded companies in the last 50, 60 years, coinciding with the Milton Friedman doctrine, go down by half. We've seen income disparity go up enormously. We've seen the negative externalities go up and increasingly paying prices for that. The length of publicly traded companies has gone down from 67 years when I was born to 17 years now. Running companies that way is simply not sustainable. And increasingly that is apparent. There are exceptions. We can always make our case by using, but broadly that is the case. And, for every example that we like to point out where a company that is strongly purpose-driven, has ESG written all over its actions, when a company like that fails, we try to celebrate it and point out that that model of business is naive. But we fail to recognize the thousands of companies that have headed to the graveyard of dinosaurs because they were swearing at the altar of shareholder primacy. So we have to be very careful here and look at the bigger picture. And increasingly, that bigger picture points towards a need to bend the curve. And it doesn't mean giving up on capitalism. Capitalism is basically trying to seek a return on capital that currently is too narrowly defined as financial capital. But if we would broaden that definition to also include now very important parts of capital, which we call human or social or environmental capital, then I am the first one to believe that capitalism is a wonderful tool to address the world's challenges. In Unilever, that got translated during my tenure in a 300% shareholder return, outperforming our competitors, well outperforming the markets. I don't think it has to come at the expense, nor should it come at the expense of shareholders. That would be naive. We have to show, and increasingly with the hard facts, that that form of capitalism is actually very good for the people that allocate capital, because we need that capital to be allocated to these key areas where transitions are needed. How do you decarbonize the global economy? How do you change our food systems? These are major changes that need to happen that require a lot of capital, and that can only come if the people that provide that capital start to understand it's at least equal or better returns. And I think we're close to that point now. In some cases, with a little help of governments who've woken up, like the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, or the IRA, as it's called, or the European Green Deal helping you. But in many cases, I think it's the free market already that starts to decide these tipping points.
Paul, which region of the world is most attuned, do you feel, to the need to create a more sustainable and potentially superior model of capitalism? Is there a region, or is there an industry that you respect the most? Maybe let's start with the region.
Well, if you look at the regions around the world, if you actually poll the citizens of this world, they might express it differently, but their needs are the same. Obviously, if you're in a very poor region and you belong to the 1.5 billion people on the bottom of the pyramid that have food insecurity issues, they're worried about making it sometimes to the end of the week or the end of the day, or worried to get a minimum amount of income to provide for basic necessities. So we understand that. But it's actually in those parts of the world especially that the effects of climate change, for example, are very noticeable, that people don't have the resilience or don't have the financial means to provide decent healthcare when you get an outbreak like COVID, etc. So the awareness in those parts of the world is very high on these issues. But unfortunately, they need some help. Often these issues are caused by people in the developed worlds, like the Europes or the US, where we've had a little bit of a head start, where these issues were shared amongst all of the global citizens. Now we also need to share the burdens for the ones that are left behind. Otherwise, it's not going to work. One of the major premises of humanity is our interconnectedness. And that is a very important part of this. So it is an issue for all parts of the world. And I think actually many of the innovations, contrary to what people might think about circular economy or about more efficient production models, etc., are coming from the global south, not just from this part of the world. And the benefit they have is they can often design systems in a way that makes it from the start more productive, whilst here in this part of the world you might have too much of a vested capital base that sometimes is hard to change.
Paul, do you feel the model that you see today are in America and the models you see in Europe, are they different? And which do you feel is most aligned with the idea of a more sustainable model of capitalism?
Well, I don't think they're, in essence, they are different models, but I don't think they are either good or bad in a sense that you can compare it like that. They have both elements that I think we need, and we need to try to come to the better solution of both if you compare these two systems. In Europe, we have more of a tendency to regulate ourselves out of a problem. In the US, they have more of a tendency to innovate themselves out of a problem. But both of them have benefits inherently built into that. And increasingly, we're starting to see convergence happening where things have to come closer together with the speed and scale of the change that we now need to do. And unfortunately, the time that we have left. So what you see in the US now, clearly requirements of disclosure coming in, a little bit behind Europe, but not a day too soon. Disclosure drives different behavior. You see also minimum standards being set again, something that was abolished under the previous administration. The standards for cars, the standards for energy, emissions, etc., are probably becoming a little bit more stringent in the US and catching up with Europe. On the other hand, the US has quite a attractive system of stimulating innovation. And whilst they're behind on batteries, on green energy, on some of the technologies like hydrogen and some of the other areas, I think they're rapidly catching up now that the incentives are aligned. Partly because of government incentives, the Infrastructure Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act have certainly played a role, but partly also because it's becoming increasingly economically attractive. And that's an encouraging thing to see. It was interesting in Davos, where I know you've been at times, but the Republican governors are from states that are crying woke and want to.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. Do you think
they're running around?
This is going to disable America in some way or lead to a competitive disadvantage for America?
I think the pendulum is swinging back again. We're now seeing in these states that were heralded as, banning the word ESG. We're seeing a little bit of rationalism coming in again. They're the ones that are fighting very hard for the attractiveness of the Inflation Reduction Act packages. They have their own employees protesting because their 401ks cannot invest in more responsible funds. They actually see state treasurers or at times governors overruling them. And not surprising, states like Nevada or Texas, they're actually running very fast on green energy. So we're starting to outcompete with innovation. The green energy starts to outcompete the fossil fuel parts in many of these places. We see the same with electric vehicles. They're competing for having the batteries be built in their states, whilst they're still having some woke sounds for political reasons, but often their actions are already more aligned to where I think the bulk of the population is now, including in the Republican Party, if I may be direct.
Very interesting, Paul. And I know there's a lot more to say on that, but in the last few minutes, so I'm going to ask you a final question or two. But 2030 isn't that far away. Do you think we're going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030? And if you are that optimistic, what do you think will change in the next 6 or 7 years that will make that difference?
Well, first I want to say is we've definitely seen an acceleration of this conversion to a greener, more inclusive economy, which is really the essence of the Sustainable Development Goals, not leaving anybody behind. Unfortunately, since COVID, the numbers have slipped back. Short term, like in any major transition, you cannot really expect just a smooth surface and going straight up. You have some of these hiccups, and because of some unfortunate externalities like the war in the Ukraine, we certainly have, or COVID, we have seen some disruptions to that trajectory. That has put us off the Sustainable Development Goals. There's not one goal that is in line with achieving the Sustainable Development Goals at the 2030 timing. Having said that, we've seen an acceleration at the speed of 5-6 times more over the last 2-3 years than the preceding 10 years. We're truly at a tipping point in some areas, be it mobility, be it solar and wind, be it regenerative agriculture. There are now some things coming very close to reach. And so I rest optimistic that we can manage these challenges and can stay around the 1.5 degrees. We should not abandon that target because of technology, because of the cost of action, inaction, but even more importantly, because of the millennials and the Gen Zs that certainly expect not only us, but also themselves to be a big part in accelerating these solutions. They want a seat at the table. In many cases, they actually want the table. So I rest, as Desmond Tutu rightfully said in a panel I was in with him, I continue to be a prisoner of hope.
That's a wonderful point to stop and to thank you. I know we could talk a lot more, and sometime we will, about breaking down the model of capitalism in a practical way that people can execute for themselves and their businesses and so on. But I think you've given a good taste of the story. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ketan. I appreciate it.